Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and it is the second lesson of the series dedicated to prophylaxis and prophylactic thinking in chess, in which we will see examples of the active prophylaxis. So the first position is taken from the game between Tal and Ribley, and we can see that white is already better because white has very active pieces. Especially active is the rook on d6. In addition, white has a passed pawn c4, which might be quite dangerous in the nearest future. Black's main problem is that the bishop g7 is quite passive. And what is more importantly, knight on b8 occupies extremely passive position, which makes also the rook a8 very passive. So black simply has no coordination. That's a very annoying situation. But at the same time, it's not that easy to find a spot to attack, because black has no serious weaknesses in his position. Everything looks more or less solid. Moreover, black has a chance to improve the situation with the help of several possibilities. So the most natural one is knight to c6, just developing the knight and solving the main problem. Another one is to occupy d7 position with the knight, having the same purpose. And also it is possible to play bishop to f8, attacking the rook, improving the position of the bishop a bit, because from f8 this bishop will have an access to c5 square, just to blockade white's c4 pawn. And another idea behind bishop f8 is just to attack the rook to kick it away from this active position, after which it will be not that hard for black to coordinate the pieces. So knight simply goes to c6, so rook from a8 goes to b8, and so on. So white has to do something to prevent black's possibilities, bishop f8 and knight c6, and white has a choice, of course, between several ideas. So the one idea is to put the queen, for example, on a4, which helps white to control all possible squares that knight could occupy: a6, c6, and d7. But this makes nothing to prevent bishop f8. So after bishop f8, the rook should go away from the 6th rank, somewhere on, I don't know, d1 or d2, doesn't really matter, and black has no problems with the development. So knight simply goes to c6, and black is fine. So queen a4 doesn't work. Another idea is to play queen to d1, coordinating the work of the queen and the rook along the d file. This move creates a threat of, let's say, rook d8 check, extremely annoying one, invasion to the back rank. At the same time, we can see that white controls d7 square, so this prevents knight to d7. And looks like if knight b8 moves to c6, white has a very promising idea of rook d7, just occupying the 7th rank, attacking the queen already, challenging a7 pawn, so looks very nice. In fact, black has a good tactical resource here, so rook goes to d8. Simply attacking the rook, forcing the rook to take on d8 or f7. If rook takes f7, then rook takes on d1, rook takes d1, king takes f7, position is being simplified, and here black is more or less fine, because white's pawn c4 is not that powerful. Black already managed to blockade it with the knight. Black is about to activate the rook to play maybe even f5 in the future, so black is by no means worse here in this situation. Of course, rook takes d8 also makes no sense. In this case, rook simply takes the rook with the tempo, attacking the queen, and again black is fine. So what else? How to prevent all these ideas? In the initial position, white has one more queen move, which controls all the squares that knight can occupy. It is queen to b5, very nice one. a6, c6, and d7. But, well, we already discussed queen a4 with the same idea. So what will happen after bishop f8? The difference between a4 position and b5 is that here the queen has an access to d5 square, which is very important. And the drawback of bishop f8 is that f6 is now vulnerable, and white has a chance to exploit one tactical motive. So rook takes f6, deflecting the queen from diagonal a2, g8, and after queen takes f6, queen goes to d5, check, attacking the king and the rook simultaneously. So next move will be queen takes a8, and white is a pawn up. So it is already a material advantage, and the pawn structure is better, so white is much better, and this advantage is almost decisive one. So as we can see, after queen b5, black has no chance to play bishop f8. It's not possible to develop the knight, and it's not that easy to find a good move now. So a6 looks very natural, just to attack the queen and to try to solve the problem with the development of the knight. But again, queen has an access to d5 square, so queen simply goes to d5, attacking the rook and forcing simply queen takes d5. And now white takes with the pawn. Very important move. Now pawn additionally controls c6, so preventing knight to c6, and d7 is still controlled by the rook. At the same time, we can see that rook is attacked. If it goes away, then white invades with the rook to the 7th rank. It will be just devastating. And if rook takes c1, then bishop takes c1, and this position is really ugly for black because rook is extremely active, controlling f6 and preventing bishop g7 activation. At the same time, this rook controls d7 and c6 squares in addition to pawn, so knight b8 remains passive. And if knight remains passive, this means rook a8 is also passive. And white is about just to occupy the back rank and start pushing pawn to queen. Also, it's possible to improve the position of both the knight and the bishop, and it's not very hard to understand that white simply has a winning endgame. As we can see, queen b5 is a very active move, despite it is a prophylaxis, right? So the point of the queen b5 is to prevent opponent's plan. So it is a typical prophylaxis, typical result of the prophylactic thinking. By the way, in the game, it happened that white played knight to d2, just starting the improvement of the knight's position, but this simply ignores black's plan. So after knight c6, knight e4, knight a5, black came up with a great counterplay, and after queen b5, knight takes c4, rook c6, rook takes, queen takes, and very smart move, rook d8, leaving the knight hanging on c4, but creating a counter threat of rook d1 when, for example, white takes on c4. So all this made black's position completely fine, and, well, white lost his advantage. So this example shows us two things. How important is the prophylaxis, first of all, and the second is that prophylaxis is not necessarily passive defense. So queen b5 is a very active move, maybe the most active in this position. So let's have a look on the other example. This position is taken from the game between Karpov and Bagirov, and we can see that white is better. Why? Because white has a better pawn structure, white has simply more space. White has better pieces here because we can see that knight b7 is misplaced, so it is limited in his activity. Knight e7 is also not that active, so we can see that both black's knights have no access to strong points, and we know that the knights without strong points are quite bad pieces. So white has a great bishop that controls both flanks and controls light squares in general, because there is no light squared bishop in black's camp, which means this bishop controls a light squared complex exclusively. It is very important. We have pawns on both wings, which means that bishop is quite efficient in this situation. And white's knight is also quite good because it has an access to different strong points, including a5, c5, but what is more importantly to d4, typical blockading square. And whenever the knight appears on d4, white will have just a great position, maybe a position with a decisive positional advantage. So now it's the question how to occupy d4 square and with which plan to come up, which decision to make. So to make the best possible decision, white has to take into account black's counterplay, because despite black's position is quite passive, black still has a lot of different counter-attacking ideas, and the most important one and the most dangerous one probably is a5 move. For example, if white makes a careless move king h1 with the idea of, let's say, playing f4, which looks sensible within this pawn structure, black simply plays a5, undermining white's b4 pawn. And if white plays b5, trying to create this passed pawn and control c6 square and so on, black plays a4, just fixing the pawn on a3 first of all, so it is possible to attack it in the future. But what is more importantly, when the knight b3 goes away somewhere, black's knight b7, which was extremely passive and bad piece, achieves this square c5, a good spot to occupy, and black definitely has a very rich counterplay here. So it is the first idea that black has in this position and the first plan that white has to deal with. So let's have a look on queen d2 move instead, which also looks very nice. White creates a coordination of rooks, at the same time controlling a5 square, so this move directly prevents a5 move, at the same time improving the position of the queen. In this case, black has another interesting idea. It is f6, which also looks interesting for black, so black definitely will have a counterplay here. If white takes on f6, rook takes f6, and black will have a play along the f file against white's f2 pawn. And at the same time, if white makes nothing, well, black's pawns d5 and e6 may become a great power, just starting the movement, right? So also looks not very good for white. What else? Interesting idea is just to put the bishop on b1, creating the access to d4 square for queen. Because now if black, let's say, plays a5, then queen d4, very important move, attacking the queen. And after this exchange, for example, we can see that black achieves nothing in the sense of activating the knight b7, and white simply has a passed pawn, which is very annoying one, so this position is definitely much better for white. But the problem with the bishop b1 is that, first of all, it makes nothing to prevent f6, so black still has a chance to play f6 in this situation, with the same idea to come up with a counterplay along the f file. And another problem is that bishop b1 weakens c4 square, so black can play rook f to c8, planning to occupy c4 square. And it is also annoying because if white takes on c4, this leads to appearance of the passed pawn on c4, and knight e7, which was quite passive, achieves d5 square. So this also doesn't look like the best move. So what to do here? If bishop b1, king h1, queen d2 work not that great, white needs to occupy d4 square and to prevent f6 and a5, both possibilities, without leaving the control of c4 square. So Karpov found probably the best possible move in this position, and it is queen to g4. Extremely active move, and the move that prevents all black's counterplay. So from g4, this queen has an access to d4 square. So for example, if black plays a5 now, white has several possibilities to react. So the first is just queen d4, with the same result that we already saw. After exchange, white will have just a great advantage because knight b7 remains passive. Another possibility here, which is very nice, a tactical one, after queen g4, as you can see, this queen has an access to h4 square. So it's possible to play bishop takes h7, and after king takes h7, queen h4 check, and after king g8, queen takes e7. So as a result of this operation, white won a pawn, so white has a material advantage, b4 is protected, which means knight b7 remains passive. And finally, after a5, white has simple move b5, which is also possible after queen occupied the fourth rank, because now the queen controls a4 square. So black simply has no this a4 followed by knight c5, which also means that knight b7 remains passive. White has a chance to support b5 with the help of a4. White will have just enormous advantage because b5 is now a protected passed pawn. This makes black's position really bad. So several ways to react after queen g4 against a5. What happens if black plays f6 instead? So in this situation, again, white has the solution. It is queen to h4, attacking h7 directly, and as you can see, queen from h4 controls f6, so this makes black's g6 move not possible. In that case, white simply takes f6, extremely important pawn. So what to do here? For instance, if h6, well, simple rook e1 guarantees a serious advantage for white because of all these factors that we already discussed. In addition, white has here a play against e6 pawn, which now becomes seriously vulnerable. And pay attention to light squares. They became also quite exposed. And, well, bishop d3 simply controls them, and white will have a chance to create concrete threats along those squares. So this looks very bad for black. If knight goes to g6 in this situation, then after bishop g6, hg6, and queen g3, black's pawn structure on the king side becomes a mess. And, well, it's not really possible to protect all the weaknesses that arose after black played f6 and took on g6 with the pawn. So again, after f6, queen h4 looks very nice. And finally, if after queen g4, black plays knight g6 immediately, then again, it's possible just to exchange this knight. And after, let's say, queen d4, the difference in the power of this knight and the knight on b7 is noticeable, and it should gradually decide. So white again has a serious advantage here. So after queen g4, as you can see, with the help of this active move, white managed to solve his problem. And the problem was to occupy d4, to put the knight or a queen on this blockading position, so that to improve the position even more. And at the same time, broke all possible active continuations of his opponent. So great coordination of own plans and preventing of opponent's plans. That is the core of prophylaxis. Okay, and again, as you can see, queen g4 is not a passive move, so prophylaxis here is not a passive defense, but an extremely active continuation. Okay, so black played f5 in the game, queen simply went to d4, and after knight e8 with the idea of knight c6, well, Karpov simply played b5, and, well, black has no chances to improve positions of his knights. There is additional weakness on e6 now, and white has no problems with proceeding on the queen side, like a4, a5, improving a position there, grabbing more and more space, and gradually creating a passed pawn, for example. So we should never forget that in the initial position, white had 2 pawns against 1 on the queen side, so pawn majority, and one of the plans is just to create a passed pawn. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next lessons.